You didn't come here because things are falling apart. That would almost be easier. When something breaks, a relationship, a job, a version of yourself you thought was solid, there's no ambiguity. You know something ended. You know something has to change. The crisis is painful, but it's also clear. It gives you permission to move. What you're feeling right now is different. It's quieter, more like a vibration beneath the floor than a crack in the wall. A low-grade sense that something is shifting without your permission. The life you have isn't ruined, but somewhere, slowly, it stopped fitting. Not because you changed dramatically, more like a coat that used to be yours that now belongs to someone you used to be. Maybe you noticed a few things lately that you almost dismissed. A book that landed in your hands at the exact wrong, or right, moment. A conversation with someone you'll never see again that touched something you hadn't told anyone. A dream you keep having that you haven't stopped to interpret because you're not sure you want to know what it means. Small things, unconnected things, except they don't feel unconnected. Here is what most people do with that feeling. They explain it away. They call it stress, or mood, or the algorithm recommending things that match their search history. They give it a rational name and go back to sleep. And in doing that, they miss the most important signal their psyche will ever send them. Carl Jung spent a lifetime studying what happens in the gap between the life we're living and the life we're being called toward. He discovered something that psychology has never fully known what to do with. That when deep transformation is preparing itself inside the unconscious mind, the external world begins to mirror that process with a precision that feels impossible. He called it synchronicity, not magic, not metaphysics, a psychological phenomenon, real, measurable in its impact, and almost always misread as coincidence by the people experiencing it. Paulo Coelho spent his life translating that same phenomenon into language the heart understands before the mind catches up. The universe conspires, he wrote, when you are moving toward what is most truly yours. Both men are saying the same thing, that there is an intelligence operating beneath conscious awareness that begins to move pieces on the board before you know the game has changed. That intelligence has already started moving yours. You didn't find this by accident. Something in you has been listening. Even when you thought you were just scrolling, just passing time, just looking for something to watch, that part of you already knows what this is. The only question now is whether you'll listen too. Most people hear, "The universe is speaking to you," and immediately sort themselves into one of two camps. Either they believe it completely and start reading meaning into every parking spot they find, or they dismiss it as the kind of thing printed on motivational posters next to a sunrise. Both responses miss the point entirely. And both responses are, in their own way, a form of avoidance. Jung wasn't a mystic. He was a clinician, a scientist who spent decades inside the most fractured minds of his era and emerged with something unexpected, the conviction that the psyche and the external world are not as separate as we pretend. Synchronicity, as he defined it, is not the universe sending you messages like a cosmic text notification. It is something more precise and more unsettling than that. It is the moment when an inner psychological process, something stirring in the unconscious, something preparing to surface, begins to find exact correspondence in events happening outside you. The inner and the outer suddenly rhyme. And that rhyme is not coincidence, it is signal. What Jung observed in his patients and in himself was that synchronicities don't occur randomly. They cluster. They intensify around specific moments, periods of deep psychological movement, when the self, the organizing center of the psyche beneath conscious awareness, is preparing a significant shift. The synchronicities don't cause the transformation. They announce it. They are the shadow of something approaching that you cannot yet see directly. And once you understand that, the strange events of the past few weeks start to look less like noise and more like a pattern. Coelho understood this intuitively and translated it into something the intellect resists, but the body recognizes immediately. Santiago, the shepherd in The Alchemist, doesn't receive a map. He receives omens, small, easy-to-dismiss signals that accumulate until their direction becomes undeniable. A stranger's words, a stone that falls at the right moment, a dream that refuses to leave. Each one, taken alone, means nothing. A coincidence, a mood, a trick of attention. But together, they form a language, one that Santiago learns to read not through analysis, but through a particular quality of attention. He stops explaining the signals away. He starts following them. Most people speak this language fluently. They just refuse to admit it. Because admitting it means admitting that something is moving inside them that they didn't consciously authorize. And that is a deeply unsettling thing for an ego that has spent years believing it is in charge. Here is where the practical work begins, and it is simpler than it sounds. For the next 7 days, keep a running record of what you might otherwise dismiss. The book recommendation that arrives at the exact wrong, or right, moment. The conversation that touches something you hadn't told anyone. The thought that surfaces during the one quiet moment in an otherwise loud week. Write these down without interpreting them yet. Don't look for meaning immediately. That impulse, the rush to understand before you've fully observed, is the ego trying to reassert control over a process that isn't entirely its to manage. Just record. Date it. 1 sentence, 2 sentences, enough to keep it from evaporating. At the end of 7 days, read what you wrote from the beginning. What you will find, almost without exception, is that the signals are not scattered. They are orbiting something. A specific tension, a specific question, a specific part of your life that keeps appearing at the center of what the coincidences are touching. That center is where the self is applying pressure. That center is where the turning point is actually located. Jung did this obsessively with his own unconscious material. He filled notebooks. He drew images. He mapped what was emerging with the same rigor he applied to his patients. He understood that the unconscious speaks in a language that disappears if you don't catch it, and that the act of catching it, of writing it down, of taking it seriously enough to preserve it, is itself a form of dialogue. You are telling the deeper layer of your psyche, I am listening. I am not explaining you away anymore. Something shifts when you do that. Not dramatically, not overnight. But the quality of what follows changes. The way a conversation changes when the person on the other side finally feels heard. The signals don't stop, they clarify. And what was once a vague unease begins to resolve, slowly, into something with a direction. That direction is what the next part of this is about. Because before you can follow where the signals are pointing, you need to identify the ones you've already walked past. The ones you noticed, named something harmless, and kept moving. Those are the most important ones, and you remember them more clearly than you think. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You already know which ones they are. That's the thing about these signs. They don't hide. You notice them. You just gave them a different name. The book that fell into your hands at the exact moment you needed it. The one whose first page described something you had never told anyone. You called it a good recommendation, or an algorithm, or coincidence. The conversation with someone you met once and will never see again, who said the thing you had been circling around for months without finding the words. You called it a pleasant exchange. The dream that keeps returning, not dramatic, not nightmarish, just insistently present. The same image, the same feeling, the same unresolved question playing on a loop your sleeping mind refuses to close. You called it stress. You called it your brain processing the week. And then there's the subtler one, the one that's harder to name because it doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as a feeling. The sense that the life you have, which by most measures is functioning, has quietly stopped belonging to you. Nothing collapsed. Nothing is objectively wrong. But something that used to fit now sits slightly wrong on your frame. Like a room that was yours, that someone has slowly been moving furniture out of, piece by piece, while you were busy not noticing. Jung had a clinical name for what produces these signals. He called it the constellating self, the deeper psychic center activating, beginning to organize energy around a new direction before the conscious ego has any idea what's happening. The ego, he observed, is always the last to know. It receives the memo after the unconscious has already made several significant decisions. The synchronicities are that memo arriving in external form, because the unconscious has no other way to communicate with the part of you that is still insisting everything is fine. This is why writing them down is not a spiritual exercise. It is a psychological one. When you record what you've been dismissing, you are doing what Jung did with his own unconscious material, creating a dialogue between the surface and the depth. You are telling the deeper part of your psyche that you are paying attention. And something shifts when you do that. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a conversation changes when the other person finally feels heard. Take the signs you've been carrying and ask one simple question of each. What part of my life is this pointing toward? Not what does it mean in some cosmic sense. That question is too large and too easy to avoid. Just, what does it touch? What territory does it keep circling? The answer, repeated across enough signs, becomes a direction. And direction is what the next part of this is about. Because what comes before direction is the call itself. And most people miss it precisely because it arrives too softly to feel urgent. There are two ways a turning point arrives. Most people only recognize the second. The second kind announces itself. A relationship ends without warning. A diagnosis reorders everything. A career dissolves overnight. No ambiguity. Something broke, and now you have to respond. The crisis is clarifying. It is also, in Jung's framework, what happens when the first kind of call went unanswered for too long. The first kind is what you're in now. No broken thing, no emergency, no obvious permission to stop and reconsider. Just the accumulating weight of small signals, the synchronicities, the recurring dream, the quiet wrongness of a life that looks right from the outside. Jung called this the soft call of the self. Not a metaphor, a clinical observation about how the psyche initiates transformation before the ego has agreed to participate. The unconscious begins to move. It sends what it can. It waits. Coelho understood the sequence. The universe always whispers before it shouts. Santiago's journey doesn't begin with catastrophe. It begins with a recurring dream and a stranger who seems to know too much. The call comes quietly first. The question is never whether it arrives. The question is whether you're listening at the register it's using. Here is what makes the soft call dangerous to ignore. It has no deadline. A crisis forces your hand, but the quiet turning point gives you every reason to postpone. Nothing is on fire, and so you tell yourself you'll address it later, when things settle, when you have more clarity. The settling never comes. And the unconscious, Jung observed, does not abandon its agenda. It escalates it. What began as a whisper becomes an ache. What began as an ache becomes a crisis. The shout arrives because the whisper was ignored. So here is something concrete to do today. Not eventually today. Take 10 minutes and write down the 3 moments in the past month that felt somehow significant, but that you quickly rationalized away. The conversation, the book, the dream, the feeling. Write what each one touched in you. Then look for what they have in common. Not a theme in the literary sense, but a direction, a territory. A version of yourself that keeps appearing at the edges and disappearing before you can look at it directly. You don't need a plan. You don't need certainty. You need only to acknowledge that the call is real, because the intelligence behind it didn't start with this video. It started much earlier. and it has been moving pieces you haven't seen yet. That's what we need to examine next, the nature of that intelligence and how to stop working against it. Here is something the ego finds genuinely difficult to accept. You are not the only thing running your life. There is a part of you that does not consult your preferences, your plans, or your carefully constructed sense of who you are. Jung called it the self. Not the self you perform in conversation, not the self you describe when someone asks what you do for a living, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche. The part that holds what you actually are beneath what you've agreed to be. It operates on a longer timeline than the ego. It is less interested in your comfort than in your wholeness. And it has been making decisions about the direction of your life long before you sat down to watch this. Coelho named the same force differently. He called it the soul of the world, the intelligence that connects all things and conspires toward the realization of what he called the personal legend. The language is different. The observation is identical. Beneath conscious awareness, something is navigating, something is arranging. And when you are approaching a genuine turning point, that something accelerates. The problem is that the ego interprets this acceleration as disruption. The restlessness feels like anxiety. The dissatisfaction feels like ingratitude. The pull towards something undefined feels like instability, a problem to be managed rather than a signal to be followed. So you manage it. You organize your schedule. You optimize your routine. You make the life you have more efficient rather than asking whether it's still the right life. And the intelligence beneath keeps moving, quiet and patient, waiting for you to stop managing long enough to listen. Here is where the practical work becomes uncomfortable. Sit down, not with a journal prompt, but with a direct question, and ask yourself, where in my life am I working hardest to maintain something that no longer feels genuinely mine? Not what looks good, not what made sense 3 years ago. What right now requires the most effort to keep pretending is enough? Write the answer without softening it. Don't negotiate with the discomfort. The thing that comes to mind first, before the rationalizations arrive, is almost always the thing the self has already identified. Then ask the second question, the one Coelho's entire work circles around. If I removed the fear of getting it wrong, what would the next step actually be? Not the destination, just the next step. One conversation you've been avoiding, one decision you've been deferring, one direction you keep looking toward and then looking away from. The intelligence that has been moving ahead of you already knows the answer. Your only task is to stop treating your own knowing as something that requires more evidence before it can be trusted. This is how you align with what's already in motion, not by leaping, but by taking the next step that your deepest honesty keeps pointing toward. Because here is what happens when you don't. When the soft call escalates, when the whisper becomes something you can no longer ignore. That's where we're going next. And it's the part most people wish someone had told them sooner. Ignoring the call does not make it stop. It makes it louder. Jung was precise about this. The unconscious does not withdraw its agenda because the ego finds it inconvenient. It intensifies. The synchronicities that were gentle become impossible to dismiss. The restlessness that was background noise becomes a constant presence. The life that felt slightly wrong begins to feel unbearable. Not because anything changed externally, but because the pressure from within finally exceeds the energy required to contain it. What you resisted becomes the crisis you were trying to avoid. The shout arrives, and it is always more disruptive than the whisper would have been. Coelho saw the same pattern from a different angle. Those who abandon their personal legend, he wrote, don't find peace in the abandonment. They carry the weight of the unlived life, a specific, identifiable heaviness that accumulates quietly over years and announces itself in moments of stillness, in the middle of the night, in the pauses between one distraction and the next. It is not dramatic. It is relentless, and it is entirely avoidable but only if you respond before the escalation. So the question is not whether your life needs to change. If you've made it this far into this video, something in you already answered that. The question is whether you will move while the call is still soft, while you still have the luxury of choosing how the transformation happens, or whether you will wait until the choice is made for you. Here is the most concrete thing this video will ask of you. Not a philosophy, not a reflection, an action. Before the day you're in right now ends, identify one thing in your life that the signals have been circling. One relationship, one habit, one role, one version of yourself that the synchronicities keep touching. Name it out loud or write it down with the specificity it deserves. Not, my career feels off, but I have been in the wrong room for 2 years, and I know exactly which door I've been avoiding. Then identify the smallest possible movement toward that door. Not the plan, not the leap. The smallest step that your honesty can no longer pretend isn't necessary. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who circumstance and fear assembled in your place. It does not require a dramatic gesture. It requires a genuine one. One real movement, however small, sends a signal back to the intelligence that has been waiting. It tells the self that the ego has finally heard. And when that happens, something shifts in the quality of what follows. The synchronicities don't stop, but they begin to feel less like pressure and more like confirmation. Coelho's Santiago didn't transform because he understood his personal legend completely before he moved. He transformed because he moved before he understood. The understanding came in the movement. It always does. You already know what your next step is. You've known it since before this video started. The only question, the only one that has ever mattered, is whether today is the day you stop waiting for a better moment to take it. Here is the hardest truth this video has been building toward, and it would be dishonest to soften it now. You did not find this by accident. The fact that this reached you today, in this specific season of your life, with these specific signals accumulating around you, is not coincidence in the dismissible sense. It is the same phenomenon we've been examining for the last 30 minutes. The interior making itself visible through the exterior, the psyche finding a way through. You were already in motion before you pressed play. This was part of the motion, which means the question is no longer whether your turning point has begun. Jung was clear. When the synchronicities cluster, when the restlessness intensifies, when the life you have starts quietly refusing to fit, the process has already started. It started without your permission because it doesn't require it. The self does not wait for the ego to feel ready. It moves when it moves. You are already inside something larger than this video, larger than this moment, larger than the version of yourself that has been managing carefully and calling it living. What you do with the next hour matters more than what you do with the next year. Not because 1 hour changes everything, but because the pattern you establish in the immediate aftermath of recognition is the pattern that determines whether the recognition becomes transformation or becomes another thing you understood and then set aside. Most people set it aside. They feel the weight of what they just heard, they acknowledge it privately, and then they return to the exact life the call has been asking them to reconsider. Not out of weakness, out of the very human tendency to wait for a moment that feels more certain, more prepared, more ready than this one. There is no such moment. There is only this one, and what you choose to do inside it. So before you move on, before the next video, the next notification, the next thing that pulls your attention back to the surface, do one thing. Return to what you named in the last section, the specific thing the signals have been circling, the door you've been avoiding. Write down the smallest genuine step toward it and assign it a time. Not soon, a time. Today or tomorrow or this week, with enough specificity that it becomes an appointment with the part of you that has been waiting. That act alone, The act of taking your own signals seriously enough to schedule a response is the beginning of what Jung meant by individuation, not the completion of it, the beginning. The work that started here does not finish here. It continues in the questions you sit with, in the signals you stop dismissing, in the slow and non-linear process of becoming more genuinely yourself. That process has its own momentum now. And if something in you already knows that there is more to examine, more layers, more mechanisms, more of the unconscious architecture that shapes the life you're living without your full awareness, then you already know what comes next. It's waiting for you. And so is the part of you that's finally ready to look.